By touching this spot now exactly as I will demonstrate, you will feel something inside you begin to change. Your body will relax, your mind will quiet, and perhaps for the first time in a long while you will feel safe. Yes, this is real and not a metaphor. It has been discovered that behind the ear, there is a point that acts like a healing seal, a vibrational button that, when activated correctly, causes your body to automatically enter a state of regeneration. However, no one has told you this because this gesture is too simple, too subtle, and too powerful. But now you will learn. In the next few minutes, you will discover how to activate this hidden spot with just 2 fingers, and why this touch is capable of reprogramming your nervous system, dissolving tension, and even restoring your sleep. But pay attention. If you leave before the end, you will miss the most important part of the practice. Because the real secret is not in the spot itself, but in the frequency you activate when you touch it with awareness. And only those who stay until the end will understand how this gesture transforms your body into a natural field of healing. Let's begin this activation right now. Feel the silence, for it is in the silence that the secret begins to vibrate. The body is the harp of the soul. It is up to you whether you draw music or noise from it. The modern view of the body is cold, limited, and fragmented. Bones, muscles, organs all separated, as if it were a disassembled machine, a mechanism to be repaired, adjusted, patched. But this idea of the body as a machine is recent. It was born with mechanistic science, with Western laboratories, with the obsessive pursuit of control. Before that, the body was perceived differently. It was a temple, a living space, a channel between worlds. The most ancient traditions always recognized the body as the meeting place of the visible and the invisible. The body was not the end of existence, but a frontier. And every point on the skin, every breath, every pulse carried subtle meanings, silent energies, vibrational flows that communicated with dimensions unseen by the eye. This was not superstition, but wisdom, a wisdom that was observed, felt, and passed down. The monks of the East knew this. They meditated for years not to escape the body, but to deeply inhabit every part of it. The shamans of the forests spoke with spirits not only through words or plants, but through gestures. They touched specific points on the body to activate visions, release memories, and heal invisible wounds. Touch was a language, and this language transcended time and space. The yogis of India developed such refined techniques of vibrational control that they could modulate their frequency with a single finger, a single breath, a single thought. To them, the body was an energetic map. And where modern medicine sees bones and cartilage, they saw vortexes, currents, and energetic knots that opened with awareness. But this awareness does not come automatically. It must be awakened. And this is where a point that few people know of comes into play. There are regions in the body that function as bioenergetic portals. They are transition zones, points of intersection between the physical and the subtle. And one of these zones is located precisely where no one pays attention. Near the ear, between the skin and the bone, where the right touch creates a vibration that does not stop at the skin. It resonates. It opens a path. In records attributed to Thoth, there is a reference to this practice. He called it the art of silent invocation. A gesture, an inhalation, a breath, and the bridge between worlds would open. Not with words, but with presence. Not with force, but with vibration. This technique was taught only to initiates because it required more than physical skill. It required aligned awareness, pure intention, and inner mastery. The gesture itself was not enough. It was the energy behind the gesture that created the phenomenon and that changes everything. Because if the body is a temple, it makes no sense to treat it like an object. It makes no sense to force it, punish it, or ignore it. It makes sense to listen to it, to touch it with respect, to inhabit it with presence. Healing does not begin when you interfere. Healing begins when you recognize that the body knows the way. It simply needs to be reminded. And this reminder does not happen in the mind. It happens in the vibration. It's like tuning an instrument. An untuned body vibrates with tension, fatigue, and anxiety. But when a precise gesture touches the right point, the frequency changes. The body remembers its original melody, and it is from this memory that the process begins. The gesture that silences the inner noise and opens the first door. From the moment you recognize the body as a temple, the way you move within it changes. Gestures are no longer automatic. Touch is no longer distracted. Everything begins to have intention. And it is at this exact point that a simple movement can become a portal. It requires neither strength nor an elaborate technique. Imagine two fingers, just two, lightly touching an almost forgotten area, as if caressing the very space between the physical and the subtle. This gesture does not provoke, it invites. And when performed with presence, it activates an immediate response. The entire body responds with a kind of silence you do not hear with your ears. It is an inner pause. You feel a pause that switches off survival mode, calms the urgency, and effortlessly breaks the cycle of tension. This gesture, simple at first glance, is present in various ancestral rituals, not as a medical technique, but as a spiritual expression. In indigenous ceremonies, the gentle touch behind the ear was performed by elders as a sign of blessing, of returning to the center, of reconnecting with the origin. In Eastern traditions, this same gesture appears at moments of energetic transition as a vibrational reminder that it is time to let go of control and trust the flow. In the healing practices of ancient Egypt, this touch was part of rituals for purifying the body and aligning the spirit, but it was always done in silence. Always in silence. Because for the initiates, silence was more than the absence of sound. It was the frequency of creation. Thoth taught that every word is born from silence, that the most powerful sound is not the one that is shouted, but the one that vibrates where no external noise can reach. And this gesture is that a silent word spoken through the skin. It acts directly on the invisible language of the nervous system. And that language does not understand hurry. It does not understand force. It understands intention. It understands gentleness. It understands presence. When you touch with that vibration, you send a direct message to your inner field. You can rest now. You are safe now. And in that safety, the body begins to reorganize itself. Not because it was forced, but because it was reminded. Interestingly, even without being aware of it, many people have already intuitively resorted to this gesture. In moments of pain, fear, or fatigue, the body brings the hand to the side of the head, rests it behind the ear, places the fingers there as if seeking refuge. This is not a coincidence. It is cellular memory. It is the body trying, in its own way, to find the path back to the center. And that path begins right there. In that gesture, in that instant, when you silence the external noise with an internal touch, and the touch, as small as it may seem, becomes the first key, a vibrational key that, when activated, does not just open a sensation, it opens space. This gentle pressure behind the ear, when done with true intention, does not stop at the touch. It passes through the skin, penetrates the tissues, and reverberates deeper than you can imagine. Because right there is one of the most neglected points in modern wisdom, yet one of the most revered by the oldest spiritual traditions. This is not a coincidence. It is direct access. This subtle point is connected to the vagus nerve, a simple name that hides a monumental function. It is like a sacred electrical network that runs through the brain, heart, lungs, intestines, and even through subtle regions that science barely understands. It is the nerve that decides, in the absolute silence of your system, whether your body will live in a state of war or healing, of tension or regeneration. It is the nerve that says fight, or the nerve that says trust. And the most impressive thing is that this choice happens without your awareness. It happens thousands of times a day. And if the body is stuck in constant alert, the system never shuts down. Fatigue becomes chronic, sleep is never deep, digestion becomes imbalanced, and the mind gets stuck in a loop. And all of this begins in that hidden energetic center, which can be touched with a simple gesture but acts like a switch. This access point, located behind the ear, was not ignored by the spiritual civilizations of the past. On the contrary, in the oldest Egyptian doctrines, Thoth described it as one of the seals of vibrational rest, a point of energetic transition capable of activating the inner state known as mate, supreme balance. Not a static balance, but a dynamic equilibrium between opposing forces, tension and relaxation, action and surrender, presence and emptiness. When this seal is activated, something silently changes. The body stops protecting itself and begins to restore. The energy that was previously used for watching, resisting, and defending is redirected to healing. And the most profound part is that this happens effortlessly, without complex techniques. The response is organic because it is not the touch that forces healing. It is the body that recognizes the gesture as permission. This point, though small, carries a gigantic potential for vibrational reorganization. It is like triggering a forgotten code, an internal command that interrupts the stress cycle and releases the natural flow of self-healing. And this code does not need medication. It needs intention. It needs presence. It needs awareness. The mystery schools used this knowledge in initiations where silence was absolute. The touch behind the ear marked the moment when the initiate left the reactive mind and entered the space of the spirit. There, they no longer needed to understand. They just needed to feel. And that feeling was so deep that it often led the entire body into a state of vibrational stillness that lasted for hours. This is the same state you can experience by touching this point with reverence. Because when the body realizes it is safe, it does not just rest. It opens up, it releases, it trusts again. And it is precisely in that moment that the invisible process begins. The forgotten ritual that redesigns your nervous system. In the moment the body recognizes its safety, something profound begins. It is not something you control with your mind. It is a response that comes from within, a silent recognition that echoes through all layers of your biology. The touch, when performed with true presence, seems to release an ancient memory, a memory not in words, but in the skin. It is as if the body hears a voice it has been waiting its whole life to hear. A voice that speaks not with sound, but with vibration. And that vibration says, everything is okay. This area behind the ear has been given the same symbolic name by different traditions, the ear of the soul, because that is where the soul listens when the body begins to trust again. And this is not poetry. This is a precise fusion of neurobiology and the energy field. Because at this point, where the skin is thin and the nerve endings are sensitive, the touch acts like a key. It does not just activate physiological circuits. It awakens a feeling that no medicine can imitate, the feeling of being supported from within. The ancient masters knew this. In the regeneration rituals of ancient Egypt, initiates would not enter the deepest states of meditation without first performing this gesture. They used the touch as a vibrational signal to silence the external world and open the inner channel. They said this was the transition point between noise and the heart, a direct access to the vibrational state needed to enter the halls of a mentee. Not as an out-of-body journey, but as a vertical dive into the center of one's own being. By touching there, the initiates were not just preparing the body. They were telling the spirit, it is now safe to return. Because the soul, when it feels the body is at war, retreats. It does not express itself. It protects itself. And when the soul protects itself, everything slows down. Creativity, healing, joy. But when the body lets down its guard, the soul descends. And it is in that descent that the field begins to reorganize from the inside out. This reorganization cannot be explained by logic. It is something you witness with your body. You begin to notice subtle changes. Breathing becomes deeper without effort. The gaze softens. The heartbeat synchronizes with the environment. The entire body begins to operate at a different rhythm. A rhythm of trust, of integration, of presence. And the most remarkable thing is that all of this begins with the simple recognition that it is no longer necessary to fight. The touch tells the nervous system that the threat has passed, even if the world outside remains the same. Because what changes is not the environment, it is the internal state that perceives that environment. And when that state changes, the body enters a mode of spontaneous healing. Because the system knows what to do, it always did, it just needed permission to act. This permission is what this touch delivers. A vibrational authorization for the body to stop defending and start restoring, not with tension, but with tenderness, not with resistance, but with gentleness. And this gentleness is, in fact, the greatest strength, because it reorganizes everything without needing to break anything. And it is exactly at this point of deep trust that the ritual begins. Because it's not just about the touch, it's about the way you touch. The intention vibrating behind the gesture. 2 fingers, aligned breath, total presence. When these 3 forces meet, what happens goes beyond physiology. The energy field moves. The nervous system, which for so long operated in a state of vigilance, begins to reorganize. And this reorganization is not a technical process. It is a silent ceremony between the body and the spirit. Every conscious breath sends a signal to the system, an ancient reminder that says, you can trust. And this phrase, when vibrating in the field, has a real effect on neural connections. It's as if each fiber, each cell, each electrical impulse begins to tune into a new frequency, a frequency of permission, of surrender, of presence. And as that happens, a forgotten memory is reactivated. A memory that belongs not to the rational mind, but to the soul embodied in the body, a vibrational memory. The ancient alchemists knew this. They called this memory the memory of the ether, a kind of code imprinted in the subtle layers of the body long before any language or thought. This code can only be accessed in specific states of consciousness. And one of the most direct paths to it is the rhythmic touch on the mastoid area, synchronized with the breath. This point, connected to the vagus nerve and energy reception zones, acts as a transmitter between the biological plane and the subtle plane. When the gesture is performed regularly and with intention, it begins to dissolve what the alchemists called mental lead. This expression referred to the psychic density accumulated from traumas, beliefs, fears, and chronic tensions. The lead that prevents the gold of consciousness from shining. The lead that makes the mind heavy, anxious, and reactive. By dissolving this vibrational lead, the body enters a new alchemeth transmutation from a state of survival to a state of regeneration. This process does not happen in a hurry. It is not about speeding up results. It is about entering a new internal rhythm, a pulse that comes from within and can only be heard when everything around falls silent. And in that living silence, every touch gains power because it is no longer just an external movement. It is a vibrational invocation, an invitation for consciousness to return to the temple of the body. With each repetition, the gesture ceases to be just a physical act and begins to be recognized by the nervous system as a familiar language. As if the body says, I know this, I've been here before. And in that recognition, deep layers of tension begin to melt. The muscles release, the heart rate stabilizes, the internal flow opens, the alchemy begins. And the most impressive thing is that all of this is done with what you already have. No medication, no external stimuli, just presence, gesture, and breath. 3 elements that, when combined at the right point, open a vibrational rift. A passage that crosses the dense systems of matter and touches the most subtle plane of being. It is in this rift that the impossible begins to become accessible. But what happens when this rift is crossed with awareness? What does this gesture reveal when it becomes a true spiritual portal? This is the part that almost no one knows. And it is here that the most forgotten secret begins to emerge. The vibrational code of tenderness that was written in your DNA. It is in this moment of dissolving the mental lead that the body begins to listen to another frequency, a more subtle, deeper, more intimate vibration. And it all starts with a gesture that at first glance seems small, but when done as a sacred caress, transforms into a secret language that only your nervous system understands. This is the point where a silent reprogramming begins to happen. There is no effort. There is no mental command. There is only recognition. The body recognizes this touch as something ancestral, as if saying, I know this. This is safe. This touch retrieves what the ancients called primary safety, the original vibrational state of being before fragmentation, before the fall, before fear. It is a return to a home that has no walls but has a frequency. And when that frequency touches the skin and penetrates the nervous system, something sacred happens. The body stops fighting itself. The heartbeat slows down. Anxiety quiets without negotiation. The mental field, accustomed to survival, begins to allow. And in that allowing, the soul breathes. Thoth spoke of what we now know as DNA not just as biology, but as light in the form of a serpent that sleeps in spirals, waiting for the right vibration to awaken. And that awakening does not happen with shouting, with shock, or with force. It happens with tenderness. The vibrational tenderness of this gesture activates the forgotten code within each cell, a code that cannot be accessed through logic, but through surrender. And when it is activated, dormant parts of your being begin to awaken, not as an explosion, but as a remembrance. It is as if each cell starts to remember what it is like to live in peace, as if the body finally understands that it is home. And this state, which seems invisible to the eyes, begins to impact the visible. Symptoms cease, inflammations dissolve, deep sleep returns, digestion balances, vitality emerges, not because you made an effort, but because you touched a point and delivered your vibration with intention. It is exactly at this point in the journey that the practice ceases to be an isolated action and begins to take shape as a rite that transforms the relationship between body and soul. Because it is no longer just about healing. It is about reconnecting with the vibrational origin of life. And when this begins to be done at the most sensitive time of day, that threshold between wakefulness and sleep, what was once a gesture becomes a passage. When you practice this touch at night, before sleeping, something special happens. The body has already learned that this is safe, but now it learns that this is sacred, because the moment between the last thought of the day and the first glimpse of sleep is the most fertile for the invisible. The ancients called this the liquid hour. It is the moment when time slows down, the mind loosens, and the portals align. It is in this space that the gesture becomes a ceremonial key. It is no longer just a touch. It is a silent invocation, a vibrational declaration to the universe. I am ready to cross. And the body responds. The soul listens. The field opens. The gesture, once technical, becomes a bridge. And the bridge connects not just you with your inner self, but with the subtle field where dreams, signs, and mysteries happen. In the nightly practices described in Hermetic traditions, this moment was prepared with reverence. The touch behind the ear was combined with slow breathing, and sometimes with vibrational words that sealed the soul's intention. The Egyptians called this the sign of the Ka's release, a vibrational release that allowed the soul to journey spiritually with clarity, without interference from fear, guilt, or the noise of the day. The body then shifted from a shell to a temple, from a structure to an instrument. Because when you touch this point with presence, you are not just preparing for sleep. You are communicating to the universe that you are ready to access the invisible with awareness. It is the beginning of a crossing that does not happen outside, but inside. Inside the vibrational field that reveals itself between the last thought and the first dream. And that is when the gesture begins to repeat itself, at first with intention, then naturally, and then it starts to settle, to gain a life of its own, to reprogram the body without you needing to remember. What happens when this gesture becomes a habit? When it no longer depends on effort, but on vibrational memory? That is exactly what we are going to reveal now. When the gesture becomes frequency and healing becomes natural. At this point in the journey, the gesture starts to move beyond being a conscious practice. It becomes a living memory, a vibration that the body carries even when you're not thinking about it. The touch transforms into a pulse, a silent pulse that reverberates inside as a constant reminder, you are safe. After a few nights, this frequency starts to work even before the gesture happens. The nervous system, now familiar with the sensation of deep relief, begins to anticipate the state of relaxation. It's as if the body starts to fully trust, not through logic, but through vibrational repetition. The mind, which once chased control, naturally begins to surrender to stillness. And that surrender is the true fertile ground for healing. You no longer need to induce sleep. It arrives on its own because the body has learned the way back to true rest. Inflammations decrease. Digestion balances. Your mood shifts. The body's responses stop being reactive. Everything begins to self-regulate as if following a forgotten code. A code that was restored effortlessly, just with presence. Thoth called this the attunement of the living temple. To him, the body was like a divine harp. Just adjust a single string, and the entire melody changes. And the point behind the ear is one of those strings. When touched with truth, it tunes the whole field not by magic, but by vibration aligned with the origin. At this stage, self-healing is no longer a possibility. It becomes the body's natural condition. The gesture becomes frequency. And the frequency sustains balance, even on difficult days, even when everything outside feels chaotic, because inside, something remains at peace. And this is where the deepest teaching begins to emerge. A teaching that cannot be read, only lived. A silence that cannot be explained, only felt. A symbol that cannot be deciphered by logic because it reveals itself the moment you allow yourself to stop searching. You remember the touch, the gesture, the point behind the ear. But now, more than ever, you feel that all of it was just a path to something greater. A symbol left by your soul so that one day you would recognize yourself again. This point isn't just physical. It's a marker, a reminder, a whisper that says, you already knew. When you touch there with presence, after having gone through it all, something different happens. You're no longer just calming the nervous system. You're telling it through vibration, I found myself. And in that instant, the body stops reacting. It starts responding. And the response comes in the form of silence. But it's not an empty silence. It's a full silence, full of presence, full of soul, full of remembrance. This is the state that the oldest Hermetic writings called the spirit resting on its throne. The body is no longer running. The mind is no longer commanding. The soul sits in its rightful place, and the temple vibrates in harmony. This experience is not the end of a journey. It is the birth of a new cycle. Because now you're not just practicing something. You live as if this gesture were inscribed on your skin, in your cells, in your soul. And so, in the deepest silence, you return. If you've made it this far, it's because something inside you recognized this calling.